Today is Saturday, August 1st, 2026, and today is National Disc Golf Day, which I actually appreciate, because disc golf is one of those activities that looks incredibly relaxing until you realize a tree has personally decided your score needs to be worse. You throw a perfect shot. It feels amazing. Then, somehow, a branch appears from nowhere. Your disc disappears into the woods, and suddenly you're negotiating with nature like it's a bad landlord. But that's part of the fun. It's a simple game that can turn into a surprisingly memorable adventure. And honestly, that fits today pretty well, because August 1st is full of moments where something that seemed small at first ended up changing the way people experience the world. First, we'll go back to 1981, where a brand new television channel started with a music video and quietly began changing pop culture forever. Then we'll visit the small island where a summer camping experiment created one of the largest youth movements in history. And finally, we'll look at a bridge that crossed the Thames, disappeared from London, and somehow ended up thousands of miles away in Arizona. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the tiny historical details that somehow make humanity look even stranger. At midnight on August 1st, 1981, a new television channel went on the air, and the very first words viewers heard were, "Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll." Then came the first music video, The Buggles, "Video Killed the Radio Star," which, looking back, feels almost too perfect. A television network built around music videos launched with a song about a new technology changing music forever. But here's the part that's easy to forget. When MTV first launched, almost nobody could watch it. Today, MTV feels like one of the biggest cultural forces of the late 20th century. It changed how musicians presented themselves. It changed how record companies marketed artists. It changed fashion. It changed advertising. It helped create a new kind of celebrity. But on that first night, MTV was basically a small experiment available to a limited number of cable households. Only a fraction of America even had access to it. The channel that would eventually become a cultural earthquake started out more like a small ripple. And honestly, that might be the most interesting part. Because almost every major change looked small at the beginning. When the first television stations started broadcasting, people wondered if anyone would care. When the first computers appeared, many people wondered what anyone would actually do with them. When the first websites appeared, people wondered why anyone would need them. And when MTV appeared, it was basically saying, what if music wasn't just something you heard? What if music was something you watched? That sounds obvious now. But in 1981, it was a completely different way of thinking. Before MTV, music belonged mostly to radio. You heard a song, you imagined the artist, you created your own picture in your head. Then MTV changed the equation. Suddenly, the artist had a look. The song had a visual identity. The performance became part of the product. A musician was no longer just a voice coming through speakers. They became an image, a personality, a story, and that changed everything. Some artists became famous because their videos were unforgettable. Some careers were launched because someone watching television at home saw something they had never seen before. And some musicians had to completely rethink how they presented themselves because the audience was no longer just listening. They were watching. That is a massive cultural shift because humans have always connected stories with images. Paintings, books, movies, television, and eventually the internet. MTV understood that music could become a visual experience. The interesting thing is that the channel itself was also part of a larger technological transition. Cable television was still expanding. The idea of a 24-hour channel devoted to one specific type of content was still new. Today we live in a world where there are thousands of channels, streaming services, and endless content options. But in 1981, creating a channel dedicated entirely to music videos was a gamble, a weird one, a risky one, and for a while, a very small one. But small ideas sometimes find exactly the right moment. MTV arrived at the beginning of a decade when music, fashion, technology, and youth culture were all changing at the same time. And suddenly, a television channel that almost nobody could watch became something almost everyone remembered. And that brings us to another August 1st moment that started small. No cameras, no television, no massive audience. Just a group of boys on an island. In 1907, Robert Baden-Powell organized an experimental camping event on Brownsea Island in England. The goal was simple. Bring together boys from different backgrounds, teach practical skills, encourage teamwork, build confidence. At the time, nobody knew this little camp would become the beginning of something much larger. There were no worldwide uniforms, no millions of members, no badges covering every imaginable activity. Just a few boys, a campsite, and an idea. And that idea was that young people could learn responsibility by doing things. Not just reading about them, not just being told what to do, actually doing them. Cooking, building, navigating, working together, solving problems. It was a very different approach to youth development, and it caught on. The experiment on Brownsea Island became the foundation of the scouting movement, which would eventually spread around the world. And I think that there is something fascinating about putting MTV and scouting next to each other, because on the surface they seem completely unrelated. One is a television channel built around music videos. The other is an outdoor organization built around camping and character. But both started with the same thing. Someone asking, what if we tried something different? MTV asked, what if music became visual? Baden-Powell asked, what if young people learn through experience? Neither looked like a guaranteed revolution at the beginning. They were experiments, small ones. But sometimes history is changed by people who are willing to try something before everyone else understands why it matters. And that brings us to a bridge that had perhaps the strangest journey of all. Because sometimes history doesn't just change what we see. Sometimes it physically moves things we thought belonged somewhere forever. Which brings us to London Bridge. Not the song, not the old nursery rhyme, the actual bridge. On August 1st, 1831, a new London Bridge officially opened over the River Thames. And at the time, it was a massive engineering achievement. For centuries, London Bridge had been one of the most important crossings in the city. It carried people, animals, carts, and eventually thousands of vehicles moving between parts of London. The new bridge was designed to handle the demands of a growing city. And for more than a century, it did exactly that. But then something strange happened. London grew. Traffic increased. The bridge that had once represented modern engineering began struggling under the weight of a much larger city. By the 1960s, officials decided a replacement was needed. And this is where the story takes one of those turns that sounds completely fictional. London Bridge was sold. Not demolished. Not destroyed. Sold. A businessman named Robert McCullough purchased it and had the bridge carefully taken apart stone by stone, shipped across the Atlantic, and rebuilt in Lake Havasu City, Arizona. Yes, the London Bridge is in Arizona. And this is where I think history gets especially fun. Because when someone says the London Bridge is falling down, most people imagine the old stone bridge in England. They probably don't imagine a bridge sitting in the Arizona desert. But there it is. A piece of 19th century London history thousands of miles away from where it started. And the funny thing is, that was actually the point. The bridge was not moved because someone thought it would be funny. It was moved because it had value. It represented history. It represented craftsmanship. It represented a connection to another place and another time. And sometimes preserving something means moving it somewhere unexpected. A bridge can leave London. A music channel can start with only a handful of viewers. A camping experiment can become a worldwide movement. The things that last often begin in places where nobody knows what they will become. And along the way, we celebrate the birthday of Robert Todd Lincoln, born on August 1st, 1843. Now, being the child of a famous person can be complicated, especially when that person is Abraham Lincoln. Imagine growing up with one of the most recognizable names in American history attached to yours. Every introduction comes with a comparison. Every accomplishment gets measured against someone else's legacy. But Robert Todd Lincoln managed to build a life that was his own. He became a lawyer. He served as Secretary of War. He became a diplomat. And he was the only one of Abraham Lincoln's 4 children to survive into adulthood, which already makes his story unusual. But there is another strange detail. Robert Todd Lincoln was connected to some of the most dramatic moments in American presidential history. He was present when his father was assassinated. Years later, he was nearby when President James Garfield was assassinated. And years later, he was present at the train station where President William McKinley was assassinated. 3 presidential assassinations. One person connected to all 3. It sounds impossible. The odds of one person repeatedly being near moments like that are incredibly strange. And it's one of those details that history hides in the background. Robert Todd Lincoln is often remembered simply as Abraham Lincoln's son. But he was much more than that. He lived through one of the most important periods in American history, built his own career, and somehow became connected to some of the darkest moments in the country's story. What struck me about today is how often the biggest things start out looking ordinary. MTV started as a cable channel that most people couldn't even watch. Scouting started as a small camping experiment. London Bridge started as a bridge. Robert Todd Lincoln started as a child born into one of America's most complicated families. None of those beginnings look like they would become part of millions of people's lives. But history has a funny habit of taking small things and making them much bigger. A signal becomes a cultural revolution. A campsite becomes a global movement. A bridge crosses an ocean. A person's life becomes connected to moments they never could have predicted. Anyway, the next time I see a disc flying through a park, a music video from the past, or a landmark that seems like it belongs somewhere else, I'll remember that history is full of things that refuse to stay where they started. And that reminds me of something Robert Todd Lincoln's father once said. The best way to predict your future is to create it. If you'd like to hear more of my narration work, podcasts, or other projects, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for taking a weird little walk through history with me. I'll see you tomorrow.